Welcome everyone to the U.S. Center in today's event, Climate Investment Fund's Capital Market Mechanism. Really excited to have all of you here, packed house at the U.S. Center. Again, remember you can find out the schedule of events by looking at the QR code on multiple different things here at the U.S. Center. Now would be the time to be wearing your headphones if you have them. And again, the key thing is if you want it to be louder, you tap the orange button. If you want it to be quieter, you hold the orange button. If there is a problem with your headsets, please let us know. But enough of that. I'm really happy to introduce Helena Matz. Matz, the Director for Climate Diplomacy and Energy Transformation at the National Security Council.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I would love to welcome you all to this event highlighting the Climate Investment Fund's new capital market mechanism. Before we jump into today's discussion, I want to take a few minutes to highlight some of the ambitious whole government approach the U.S. government's taking to climate action and finance. At our President's Leader Summit in April, he announced his climate finance plan and a commitment to double international climate finance and triple our adaptation finance commitments. A few months later, at his UN General Assembly remarks, he committed to double that commitment yet again and effectively committed to a six-fold increase in our adaptation finance. As part of the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, PREPARE, which he referenced several times during his World Leaders Summit remarks over the last 2 days, the U.S. has made its first contribution to the Adaptation Fund. U.S. agencies are bringing all the tools to bear that we have to mobilize climate finance and support the transition to a net zero economy. Today, we're here to talk about one of those mechanisms that we're launching in partnership with our colleagues here from the UK and Japan. The Climate Investment Fund's new capital market mechanism will be able to provide $500 million per year over 10 years to support Climate Investment Fund projects and programs, in addition to the potential to mobilize significant private and public finance. The US, Japan, and the United Kingdom are represented here today to announce their commitment both to the mechanism and our work with the Climate Investment Fund. So let me introduce our panel, and then I will turn it over to my colleagues for their introductory remarks. And I was told to make these brief. Obviously, everyone we have on the stage is incredibly accomplished. Let me start first with John E. Morton. He is the climate counselor to the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, the first person to hold this role. A recognized leader in the field of climate finance, Mr. Morton brings to the Treasury Department more than 25 years of experiences in emerging markets, investment finance, and economic and environmental policy. To not be confused with John Morton, let me introduce John Merton. Dr. Merton is the UK government's COP26 envoy. Mr. Merton was Her Majesty's ambassador to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and non-resident ambassador to the Republic of the Congo from 2017 and 2019, and is one of the people that are responsible for this wonderful gathering that we are all experiencing here today. Let me then also introduce Takaya Kishi, Deputy Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs in the Japan Ministry of Finance. Mr. Kishi is originally from the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and has a strong background in the energy sector and Green Climate Fund and Global Environment Facility. And last, and certainly not least, it is my pleasure to introduce Mafalda Duarte, the CEO of the Climate Investment Fund, an $8.5 billion multilateral fund supporting climate action in 72 developing countries for over a decade. With that, let me turn it over to Mafalda for a couple brief opening remarks.
Sorry, I have to manage the headphones and the mask. And let me first thank U.S. Government for putting up this event, and also thank Japan and UK for their leadership along with the U.S. On climate action and on climate finance. Today is Climate Finance Day here at the COP26, and the discussion is all about how do we use limited, scarce public capital to really unlock much larger flows of private investments in developing countries. And we know that climate finance is actually one of the hot topics of this COP26. And for me, it's always great to be in such events and give a message of hope and basically convey that there's a lot going on. There are investments happening in developing countries. There's private sector flows being mobilized. And we are one of those mechanisms that have been pioneering such investments for more than a decade. We have a track record of, with every single dollar of SIF money, mobilizing $10 of other capital, and 3 times our capital from private sector. And we have demonstrated over the years that this public capital, when it has a certain scale, when it can take risks that the private sector can't take, when it's concessional, and when it's patient, means that it can be repaid over a longer time frame. And when it focuses on strategic investments and brings together other financiers that are important financiers that actually know the markets, know these countries, we can have a tremendous impact. And we can have a tremendous impact not just because we are mobilizing private capital, but because we are also generating jobs, we are driving energy access and other development benefits. But we have been doing this, and we know that our contribution is important because we have been opening up markets where they didn't exist. We have been de-risking investments that wouldn't have happened otherwise. But we know that the magnitude and the scale of the challenge is quite large. And so what we have been working on over a number of years, which is a topic that is widely discussed at this COP these days, is how do we really further maximize the public capital, the scarce public capital. So this is this initiative that you're talking about, the Clean Technology Fund Capital Markets Mechanism. What we want to do is leverage our balance sheet, the assets we have under management, and issue bonds in capital markets. And we know that there's a great appetite and interest from investors because we talk to them. And in fact, with the pandemic, we are seeing maybe it's not because of the pandemic, but what we are seeing, what the data is showing is that a significantly increasing interest from investors on thematic bonds, be it green bonds, be it sustainability bonds, sustainability-linked bonds. So there's a great appetite out there for investors. We offer a portfolio of assets purely dedicated to climate objectives in developing countries, and it is a portfolio that is highly diversified globally, and it is a portfolio that is led in terms of due diligence by the multilateral development banks, which gives a lot of comfort to investors as well. So this is what and of course, these 3 governments that are here with us today, without them, this wouldn't be possible because they represent around 90% of the equity we have in the Clean Technology Fund. So it's because of them and the work that all of the institutions that are implementing the resources that we have under management and the track record that they have built, that it is possible today to be talking about this mechanism. And we are very excited about the contribution that it can provide as an example to many others that might want to do the same in this climate finance space. So I leave it here.
Thank you so much for that overview. Let me turn it over to Deputy Vice Minister Kishi, please.
So thank you, Helena, and thank you for having me today. And first of all, Japan greatly welcomes the launch of the CTF capital market mechanism, accelerating the transition away from coal and supporting the integration of renewables are our most urgent common challenges in order to achieve the 1.5 degree target globally. And climate finance for developing countries is one of the major topics in this COP meetings. Yesterday, Prime Minister Kishida announced Japan's intention to add another $10 billion to our $60 billion commitment over 5 years. While the amount of money is important, of course, but at the same time, the implementation and delivery of each project are also essential for the steady emission reductions throughout the world. We are very hopeful that the new CIF mechanism will address both of these points, as the CIF already has proven track record. As long as Japan continues the financial contribution to the funds, Japan attaches great importance to governance of the mechanism, making sure that the program is being operated effectively and efficiently will be the key to success for both contributing countries and beneficiary countries. I'm encouraged and grateful that the administration unit is working very hard to meet our expectations. Thank you, Mafalda. And also coordination among donor countries, such as especially with UK and the United States. So for Japan to decide the participation, this was also an important element. And back in Asia, the ADB has launched a new mechanism for energy transition to help speed up the decommissioning of coal. We strongly hope that these kinds of ambitious efforts by the MDBs will be interconnected and coordinated with this CIF's bond issuance financing mechanism. Lastly, when providing specific support to the countries, it is important to encourage their transitions along their own net zero pathways based on each country's circumstance and development challenges. So we should encourage developing countries to adopt the best available technologies and energy options for each of them to ensure their best effort emission reductions. So we hope that this new mechanism will open up new horizons in addressing the climate finance challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister, and congratulations on the announcement that was made yesterday. It's incredibly impressive. Let me now turn it over to my colleague, John Morton.
Thanks very much, Helena. Can people hear me? Good. So it's very surreal to be speaking like this. It's a real pleasure to be here. And before I speak about this particular mechanism that we're launching and endorsing today, I just want to say what has been happening outside this hall over the course of Finance Day, and we've all been in our own different tracks, I'm sure. But I think the headline of today, as far as the Treasury Department is concerned, and as far as Secretary Yellen is concerned, a first-time Treasury Secretary appearance at a COP for the U.S. government, is the fact that you see such an incredible alignment of private capital that is now prepared to and looking to invest alongside mechanisms like the one we're talking about today in addressing climate needs and net zero transition needs more broadly. And so what this mechanism does so nicely is it innovates structurally, and it innovates towards private capital mobilization, and it innovates towards more capital. So more capital designed in a very innovative way, and any of you who have been in the climate finance world for a while hear the word innovation and innovative finance a lot. But what does it really mean? I think you have a clear example here today of how you innovate using tools that exist, bringing them together in a more cogent, clear way, and really catalyzing climate impact and private capital mobilization at the same time, which is why we're so pleased to be joining our partners from the UK, from Japan, and from the climate investment funds to support the launch of this important new innovative vehicle. And I think in terms of the impact that this fund will have, these are all projections, of course, but looking forward, we hope that this is a vehicle that can really be a game changer for private climate finance. We estimate, and using SIFs calculations that we've looked at as well, that this vehicle could, in the relatively short term, mobilize an additional 500 million per year of capital. And if you look at SIFs historical mobilization rates of private capital, you're talking about billions of dollars a year of new climate finance flowing through trusted, established programs into emerging markets and climate infrastructure. And that's a critically important innovation and a critically important addition to the climate finance landscape. So using reflows from existing programs as collateral to back the issuance of new green bonds makes fundamental economic sense, but it also is new and innovative and takes creativity and hard work to get implemented. And frankly, this idea, Mafalda knows well and the SIF team knows well, has been under review and design for quite some time. And it really took leadership from Japan and the UK and the US, along with our partners, our CTF partners, Germany, France, Canada, and others, to make this a reality today. So I'm really pleased to be here, look forward to the discussion, and appreciate everyone's attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And I will say, as you'll see as we facilitate this conversation, John is really our climate finance expert, and I am more of a generalist. So it's really just such a pleasure to hear from him and our team here. And with that, let me turn it over to John Merton.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for hosting this event here in the US Pavilion. There are not many things that I do as a civil servant in the UK that make my teenage daughter, who's 17 years old, proud, but working on this issue is one that does seem to cheer her up. And I've got another exciting thing to tell her today, which is, although I've never been to a silent disco, this is about as close as I've come. So I think if we all agree that this is a disco, then I can tick that one off and further impress my daughter. On the same theme, one of the sort of politer criticisms that was levelled at the UK presidency's efforts to coordinate on the climate agenda over the last couple of years in preparation for COP26 was Rachel Kite of the WRI, who said of a couple of elements of UK policy and our preparations for COP26 that it was like dad dancing at a disco, which was that sort of the intent was good, but it wasn't always properly coordinated, and the end result was sort of not always pleasant to behold. But I think she's driving into the point that we know that our efforts in climate change all have to be aligned, and finance is a hugely important part of that. And finance day to day, as John has alluded to, is about making sure that all of our financial efforts are aligned at helping ourselves domestically, but also internationally, pursue those net zero goals and those 2030 reduction targets, so that we're not financing the development of coal power stations on the one hand and pushing the same country to reduce its emissions on the other. And the SIFs work in general and the work of this mechanism in particular is part of our efforts to align finance around that goal, and also to bring forward the future, because we all know that where the money goes today, essentially the world goes tomorrow. And so this has to be seen in that context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I feel like every time I take this off, it's a little less graceful, but it does make me feel better. I'll think of this as our silent disco experience. So let's just jump in. Mafalda, I would love to start with you, and I think you touched on some of the points that I was going to raise. So let me pose a few questions at once, and would love to hear your thoughts. As you mentioned, CTF has been around for more than a decade. I'd be curious, from your perspective, what have you viewed as been the most dramatic shift in how CTF operates, how it partners recipient countries, and the impact it has on multilateral institutions in which you operate in? Would love to kind of hear that kind of overview, and if you can indulge us, maybe a little bit of what's next as well.
I mean, when the climate investment funds were established, they were established to bring about the new business model, not just in terms of climate finance, but development finance as well. Because what we are all about is bringing the multilateral development banks as a system together and working very closely with the governments and the private sector institutions in countries, and really supporting and incentivizing strategic discussions about the challenges and opportunities. And through that process of conversation with the multiple ministries, the multiple partners in the country, with the multilateral development banks, but also hearing from civil society, basically come up with a proposal on how do you really maximize the public resources that are being made available, and how do you really try to mobilize as much as possible other finance into a larger coherent package of investments. And it's not easy. I mean, I have to say it's not easy, because the banks as a group of institutions, the multilateral development banks as a group of institutions, they are quite similar, but they aren't necessarily used to work like this. And so we have been over this decade, over more than a decade, supporting and incentivizing this work, and it is proven to be delivering impact and results. We have independent evaluations, basically going out to countries and making the assessments and saying that this model works. And this is what we are hearing right now. Again, in this COP, on Finance Day, I heard Mark Carney this morning in the plenary talk about country platforms. I heard it from several speakers, and John alluded to this right now, public finance used to catalyze as much as possible private capital. And this is what we have been doing, and pretty much the intent right now is take it to the next level. So how do we even bring more partners, financiers, more private capital, into the programs that we will be launching tomorrow on energy transition? How do we bring even a wider range of partners? And based on what we have learned over the past decade, more than a decade, draw from those lessons, what are really the instruments, what are the mechanisms that we have to be thinking about and promoting further so that we are really mobilizing that private capital. This morning I was in an event in the UK Pavilion where I was also talking about private sector capital mobilization. As far as our portfolio is concerned, we have been doing a number of things. Of course, supporting project developers and de-risking really their investments where they can't come in without certain tools. Jump-starting markets and really bringing in the commercial lenders, the domestic commercial lenders, and this we do. And I think there's a great potential to do a lot more here, bringing that commercial, national commercial debt to bear, and also guaranteeing aggregation platforms of assets against which bonds can be issued as well in domestic markets. And here we are hearing about this in this COP and in all of these events. We need to do a lot more of this, but we also need to set up mechanisms, which is what this CTF capital markets mechanism is about. We need to set up mechanisms where we can tap to the institutional capital that can't really go at the project level. And so this is one contribution. As I said, we need more like this, because yes, we hear there's a lot of capital. There's even this morning we heard there's $130 trillion under the Glasgow net zero, I forget the acronym. The lady this morning said it's a Korean, it has the name of a Korean band. So we have that capital, and we have that capital that is interesting to contributing to this ambition, net zero ambition, and we need to basically set up these mechanisms and these vehicles that actually enable them to do what they want to do and really help advance this agenda in developing countries. I mean, I make one point quite often, which is it's really important what the US does and what the UK does and what the EU does on climate action domestically, because they have to show leadership, and this is what they are doing in other OECD countries. But I think we have to realize 2/3 of the trillions and trillions of dollars of investments that will happen in the coming decades, they will happen in developing countries. And if we don't make sure that these investments are low carbon resilient investments, we have just locked in a lot of capital and we've basically put ourselves in a trajectory that is not Paris aligned. So it is really important to put up mechanisms, to set up mechanisms that channel this institutional capital, these larger pools of capital, into developing countries.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Let me now turn it over to Deputy Vice Minister Kishi. Japan is a significant contributor to the GCF and GEF, as well as the SIFs. What are Japan's priorities for its climate finance coming out of the COP26?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you mentioned also the GCF and GEF. So yes, our concern is focusing on the overall architecture of climate finance. In that sense, the CIFs are expected to address the needs which other mechanisms cannot reach for the time being. This is what we call additionality or complementarity of CIF. So we're thinking of this kind of thing. So in that sense, the additionality and complementarity of the CIF include, for example, first of all, smooth coordination with MDBs, and secondly, the ability to scale up financing through mobilization of public and private finance. And also, thirdly, the strength of the CIF would be the credible track record in, for example, clean technology investments. So, and also besides, the governance of the CIF is functioning reasonably well, thanks to the continued efforts of the parties concerned. So, and also some kind of review mechanism for effective and efficient implementation is also properly discussed in steering committees, which I understand. So this innovative mechanism can help fill the financing gap, huge financing gap, especially focusing on high emission and middle income countries by leveraging the CTF balance sheet. So it will also contribute to improving the value for money from the perspective of both contributing countries and also the recipient countries when it comes to the overall architecture of climate finance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Let me turn over to my colleague, John Morton. The U.S. was instrumental in the creation of the SIFs, established initially under a Republican administration in our government, funded by the Obama administration, and now continuing to evolve and be implemented under a Biden administration. Would love to hear how you look at that approach and what the value the U.S. as a whole sees in working through the SIFs and its interaction with other organizations.
Thanks, Elena. And I think what you just said is interesting. It harks back to a distant era where Republican administrations stood up and, in fact, were the champions for the creation of the SIFs. And Hank Paulson, when he was Secretary Paulson, when he was Secretary of Treasury, was a leading advocate and, in fact, helped create the SIFs, on his watch. So The SIFs are in fact born out of a Republican administration and have enjoyed support on both Democratic and Republican sides since then. So it's somewhat unique in many ways within the climate landscape at the moment. I would say that what we see in it is very similar to what Mr. Kishi mentioned in terms of additionality, complementarity, and nimbleness, perhaps. The Secretary Yellen has spoken about how when we think about how to most effectively allocate relatively scarce public resources for climate finance, we need to be thinking about what is the bang for the buck. What is the climate bang for the public dollar buck? That's another way, I think, of saying additionality or complementarity. And I think the SIFs have proven that they can deploy capital effectively and in a differentiated way over their existence. And that is, in this world we're in, the speed of deployment is as important as the quantum of capital that you have on your balance sheet at any time. We need to be moving money relatively quickly. Every year we move forward our deployment targets, that's better and better. We're racing against the clock here. And so I think one of the things that we see in SIF is a proven model to deploy money quickly through the multilateral development banks in a nimble way. I would say, I think that, again, the types of programming and programs and innovation that we've seen come out of the SIFs recently differentiate it nicely in the landscape. One of the programs that the U.S. has been quite excited to be involved with, along with our partners, is the Accelerated Coal Transition Program. And I just highlight it very quickly, but for years and years, public finance in fossil fuels has been about curtailing or stopping finance for coal and other high-emitting assets, and you've seen that play out over the recent years, beginning in the Obama administration. Now we're getting to the really important piece, which is, in addition to stopping lending to high-emitting assets, how do we finance the expedited closure and transition of existing point sources of high-emitting assets around the world? Unless and until we do that, we're not going to get anywhere close to 1.5 degrees, right? So we need to stop doing brown finance to the extent we can and as quickly as possible, but we need to help countries transition away from their current highly carbon-intensive economies. And John and I have had the opportunity to be in South Africa recently and had both of our Prime Minister and President announce just yesterday, the time flies by, doesn't it, yesterday, a partnership to work with the South African government alongside the German and the French and the EU on a partnership with South Africa to help them transition away from coal. That program will be in the spotlight of the Accelerated Coal Transition Program that has been pioneered by the climate investment funds, and that will likely benefit from this funding mechanism. So it's all part of, I think, an innovative ecosystem of programmatic innovation, funding innovation, and hopefully moving money quickly to help decarbonize the global economy.
Thank you so much for laying out some of the key components of this really important ecosystem. John Merton, let me turn it over to you. The UK government has a consistent history of supporting the Clean Technology Fund, including GESP, ACT, REI. How does the CTF and the broader programs as part of the climate investments funds fit into the UK's broader climate agenda?
Thank you, Helena. So you have on this panel a very balanced panel. You have experts like Mafalda who really know what they're talking about, and then you have generalists like myself who struggle a little when you get into the alphabet soup of individual programs for some of the MDBs. But one of the advantages about being a generalist, and particularly in the world of diplomacy, is actually if you're posted to a country overseas, you see how things come together on the ground. And you can see the contradictions in the policies that your government has overseas. And one of the things that I've seen over the last few years in the course of my career is the contradiction between what we were pushing countries to do in terms of reduce their emissions and advance our Paris goals, and what our financial instruments encourage them to do. And when I was DHM in Nairobi, for example, a few years ago, it was quite easy for me to obtain export guarantees or MDB financing for projects to develop oil fields in the north of Kenya, but it was at very large sums, but it was much harder to get relatively small amounts to fund a wind farm or a solar park. And that's felt a contradiction in our policies that we've been working to resolve in the UK over the last number of years. We led out on that in March of this year, where we set out a policy that said, from this day on, no UK public funds will be used overseas to support the development of fossil fuels, with a number of very limited carve-outs. And that meant that in our diplomacy, we couldn't lobby on behalf of UK firms seeking deals in the fossil fuel sector, which completely changes the work patterns of our embassies in places like Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and so on. It means that we can't use any export credits to support trade deals in the fossil fuel sector to advance the development of fossil fuels. And it means we can't use any of our development funding to finance fossil fuels. And that's met with some sort of initial resistance, but more and more as we've advanced more widely on our Paris goals, and when we took on the COP presidency as designates 2 years ago, 30% of the world's economy was committed to a net zero target. As of yesterday, 90% plus of the world's economy is committed to a net zero target. As we've seen that, there's an increasing realization that if you help a country invest in fossil fuels, all you're doing is creating a future stranded asset. So much better, therefore, to translate that support into support for renewable energy. And that was the policy we've adopted in March with respect to our government finance overseas. But we also know that the government finance overseas is very small compared to the amount of money that gets mobilized in the private sector. It's the billions versus the trillions. So we've made it a requirement of UK legislation that from 2023, all UK listed firms will be required to disclose along TCFD guidelines the climate impacts of their portfolios and their activities, and with the UK and London in particular being a centre of global finance, that has a really significant impact upon how funds are managed. And we've also worked closely with Nigel Topping, the high-level climate action champion, to work with the private sector to bring together alliances of private sector companies to align the way they manage their resources to support delivery of the Paris goals. And we've got the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the GFANZ, the Korean boy band of climate instruments that is committed to that, and that has trillions under management. And if you put the billions and the trillions together, pretty soon you have an impact overseas. And it was interesting with Mitsubishi here, when I was in Tokyo, if you talk to the manager of the Japan Pension Fund, he controls 1% of global stock market assets. And if he aligns his portfolio along with the sort of Paris goals, then you start having an impact. If you then speak to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and so on, you start having that cumulative impact. So those are our policies that we've been advancing, and I just want to pick up on what John said about South Africa, the Just Energy Transition Partnership that we announced yesterday with South Africa and the US, the EU, France, Germany, the UK, is, if you like, a poster child, a template of how this all comes together in a country platform, where we're working with the South African government, we're working with Eskom to see how can we accelerate the decarbonisation of the South African economy. Has the most carbon-intensive energy generation system in the world. How can we accelerate the decarbonisation of that, and do so in a way in which we can bring very concessional lending through the SIFs to support some of the things that are difficult to finance, like training and retraining and job creation opportunities for communities that will be affected in the coal mining regions of South Africa? How can we bring in and leverage in then sort of perhaps slightly less concessional financing that is sort of normally available to middle income countries to support some of the areas which are financeable, but perhaps you need to crowd a little bit of support in, like transmission? And then how can we bring in private sector investment supported by equity investments from our own governments, but also private sector investment into areas such as generation, but also more widely in the green economy, like hydrogen and zero-emission vehicles, to essentially lead the South African economy on a path to decarbonisation in a way that's coherent and brings all of our policy tools together in a coherent framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, John. Really, really thoughtful and in-depth overview to your government's overall approach. I would love to pose a general question to all our panelists and pick up on something that Mafalda brought up earlier. Really what we have here is a group of mechanisms, including what we're discussing here with the CMM, that's really going to help us take our investments to the next level. But there's more. We're in the middle of the COP on Finance Day. This is a forward-looking agenda. So I would love to ask each of our panelists really one big picture question and then one question specifically about the CMM. So one, for our governments at the panel, and then from Mafalda as well, what are the overall goals for Finance Day? What does success look like today going into our implementation agenda in 2022? And in regard to the mechanism we're discussing here today, we'll love any last words on the approach to how you see our ability to work with partners to continue to leverage this mechanism in the context of this broader ecosystem that we're discussing here today. So I'm going to change it up. I'm going to start with John Morton down there, and we'll just go down the line.
Thanks, Elena. So the goals of Finance Day, I mean, I think there's a lot of different goals. Maybe I'll say, I think if you had said to the most optimistic signer of the Paris Agreement in 2015 that 6 years later we'd be anywhere, Glasgow, with 90% of global GDP having committed to net zero, let's say 75% having committed by mid-century, but 90% having committed to a net zero target, and $130 trillion worth of assets under management, representing about 40% of total assets in the world that had committed to a net zero target by 2050, and with significant 2030 decarbonization targets built into those commitments. I think even the most optimistic signer of the Paris Agreement would have said, wow, that was an immense success from a structuring standpoint, from a ratcheting ambition standpoint. And so I think the message coming out of Finance Day is that for the first time ever, you have finance ministers, you have a dedicated day to finance, you have leading finance ministers representing large portions of global GDP here, you have assets under management representing trillions and trillions of dollars who are here to talk about their net zero commitments and how they need to align with and how they want to partner with organizations like the SIF, because they now need to move capital in a way that is aligned with net zero. How they do that is unclear. This is one answer. This is tying back to this is one answer for how you align your net zero commitments if you're an investor with an emerging markets infrastructure development imperative, and in a way that you can, with an organization that has a proven track record of delivering financial results and climate impact results in emerging markets around the world. So that's how I would answer both of those questions at once. I think this is a remarkable day with the amount of capital that's been aligned and the alignment of interests and missions, and is notable, and I hope will be seen optimistically by you and others around the world who are watching.
Please.
So thank you. I'd like to make two short points. And number one is global action, of course, toward the 1.5 degrees goal. And so especially all major emitters has to act and have to set up an ambitious target, of course, and also no country should be left behind. That's the first point. And the second point would be mobilizing both public and private finance, and risk money is, I think, important. So private finance, including risk money, that's what I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much. John, please.
Should have anticipated, sorry. I'm an optimist. The world is on a transition that I think is irreversible to a low-carbon economy. According to BNEF, 90% of energy capacity additions in the global economy last year were wind and solar. So whilst the stock, for example, of energy producing assets is predominantly carbon based, the flow is almost entirely renewables. So we are on this, what I believe to be an irreversible transition to a low carbon economy. Solar is the cheapest form of power the world has ever known. The job of Finance Day is working on the understanding that money is the fuel that drives the global economy. We need to bring the flow of money into renewable energy and other low carbon investments forward to accelerate that transition, because whilst that transition I think is inevitable, it's not happening fast enough to deliver on the Paris goals and to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. So the job of Finance Day is to make sure that we essentially accelerate the transition of global finance into the low carbon economy, to accelerate the transition of the low carbon economy and to make it happen even more quickly. And the CCMM is about essentially bringing forward flows from the future to accelerate that transition today.
Excellent, thank you. And final words from Mafalda, please.
I'm also a very strong optimist, but also based on what I have seen happening over the course of many years. But I would echo several of my colleagues here to say that I think we are witnessing something quite big, because when we are talking about governments saying that they are going to be net zero by 2050, 2060, 2070, this is a very strong signal to everyone, to the private capital, to everyone, that we are, as John Merton is saying, we are on a transition. We are moving into a different direction. When you have this level of assets under management, or this $130 trillion committing to net zero as well, this is pretty significant. Now what is necessary is how do we bring these pieces together? How do we enable these trillions? How do we help the governments translate that vision of net zero into concrete policies and concrete investments? And how do we help these investors with all of these trillions under management channel those resources to where they are needed the most? And this is where this mechanism and others that you are hearing about during the COP play a big role. So I'm quite optimistic as well. I think we have a lot of work ahead of us, difficult work, because transition is difficult. We'll be talking tomorrow in Energy Day about co-transition. This is difficult. This is really difficult because it touches on people's lives. But I think, we are at an inversion point.
Thank you so much. So you all heard it here first. Optimism from our finance experts. We could probably sit here and talk for so much longer, but unfortunately I've been warned that our time is up. So I would love for you all to join me in thanking Mafalda for her leadership with the SIFs over the years, as well as my colleagues from the US, Japan, and UK for their collaboration in moving the SIF market mechanism over the finish line. Please.